Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So I want to talk about 4 considerations that you're going to want to take into account if you have to use lethal force in a without rule of law situation. Now the first one, of course, is the potential legal ramifications when order is restored. The second is going to be your own personal conscience and your own psychological well-being thereafter. The third is going to be retaliation from that person's family members or their group or their gang or whatever. And the fourth is the greater good. So let's talk a bit about this. One of the hallmarks of civilization is the judicial process, such that as we've evolved as a species, as a civilization, the judicial process has become more refined to a point where we're almost to a point where the punishment fits the crime. Although there still is a lot of really wonky laws that don't make a lot of sense. But for the most part, that's what we're moving towards. And in a without rule of law situation, there's inevitably going to be a stepping back from that, because you're not going to have the resources, you're not going to have, a holding cell, you're not going to have the means to give the person due process and prosecute them accordingly, according to the rules and laws that we have the luxury of entertaining today. So yes, there's going to be a downgrade in terms of the punishment fitting the crime. The punishment will be, in most cases, disproportionate, as it was in the pre-medieval era when, people were hung or beheaded, or, they had their hands cut off for committing crimes which today might land you a couple years in jail. So one of the considerations is the humanity that we're able to maintain. So there are implications for the greater good, and I know I might sound like Dale from The Walking Dead, but he made a lot of sense when he said that, if we're just using capital punishment or execution to solve every problem, we've pretty much lost our humanity. It's a slippery slope into the devolution of the species, into full-blown animalistic law of the jungle, where nothing else matters but survival. We're no longer a civilized people after that. But there's a couple other things to keep in mind with regards to the retaliation factor. Now, I know a lot of people very flippantly say that, well, I'm just going to start fanning the hammer and blasting people left and right when the shit hits the fan if I at all feel threatened. Well, it's your responsibility, number one, in accordance with the rule of law, which inevitably is going to come back, and there's going to be some repercussions for people who are doing stuff like that. If you're just indiscriminately, killing your people in defense, quote unquote defense, well, there's very few situations, I think, that you could argue that are genuine through and through life-threatening situations. There's not that many machete-wielding crystal meth heads who are not going to comply with a warning shot. See, there's this misconception that warning shots don't work. And in some cases, I can see that being true. But I think in a lot of cases, let's think about it. If you're breaking into a house to get food, or, unless you're a person who's in psychosis, which could very well be the case in a without rule of law situation where people don't have their medication and they're having hallucinations and they've descended into full-blown psychosis like schizophrenics, and they're just hearing voices or whatever telling them to do stuff. In that case, maybe people would not be responsive in a submissive way to warning shots. But under most conditions, if a person is not in psychosis or incredibly desperate for drugs or whatever, then they're probably going to adhere to that. Most predators take the path of least resistance, just like anybody else. So you need to strongly consider that not every situation is going to require a hammer as a tool. Warning shots can be effective. In fact, they can reduce the harm to yourself, because if you shoot somebody who maybe is trying to steal your property or is trespassing on your territory, when there's other options available, keep in mind that there is that retaliation factor. Now, if you shoot that person, you have a blood vendetta against you from people who might care about them. They might be a lone wolf, they might be a one-off person, yeah, maybe, but chances are they're going to know people, and those people are going to be upset that you just took out one of their friends. Also, I think it's very easy for people who've never had to kill somebody to speculate on how easily they'd be able to do it with no repercussions on their conscience and whatnot. I understand the rationale that it's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6, and that I would rather be stricken with post-traumatic stress disorder than to have died. I understand that, and I understand that there are situations, there's going to be many situations where it's going to be justified for you to use lethal force because you felt that your family was at harm. If your door's getting kicked in the middle of the night, and you have children in the house, and these people are armed, then absolutely, a warning shot may not be in the cards at that point, especially if they fire the first shots. So not every situation is going to require excessive use of force, and you can make it worse for yourself. That's what I'm saying. And a lot of people who actually have had to put people down, maybe in the line of combat or maybe in self-defense, I highly doubt they're going to brag about it. If they do, they probably have some psychopathic tendencies. Psychopathy is a personality disorder. I'm not talking about psychosis with the schizophrenics, but psychopathy is a personality disorder where people have an inability to feel empathy for others. So they can kill as many people as they want and never be stricken with post-traumatic stress disorder. I would be very wary of anybody who was so quick to the gun and who showed no remorse. Even if a person was trying to kill you and you put them down and you don't at least reflect on that for a few seconds, something's wrong, in my opinion. I think people like that are potential liabilities. Now, that said, you need people who are decisive. You need people like that in certain contexts. So these are just things to your consideration. Your conscience, the greater good, the legal ramifications is another thing. That's going to be a big issue, especially depending on the country you're in. Like, I live in Canada, so here the repercussions for people using lethal force, particularly with firearms, is much more severe than it would be in the United States. We are allowed to defend ourselves, but there's a very thin margin of acceptable use of force with respect to that. And a lot of it has to do with how our firearms are stored. It's not so much that we don't have the right to defend ourselves with firearms, it's just that they need to be stored. The ammo needs to be stored separate from the firearm, which needs to be locked up. So it's simply never going to be accessible enough that you could prove that, okay, somebody was kicking in my house, they were shooting my family, so I went downstairs, I had to open the safe, I put the bullets in the gun. There's going to be few situations where it's relevant. One point I would like to retract from my shotgun shell video was the idea that using target load is a potentially less than lethal option. And I want to retract that statement because after reflecting on it for a bit, I think it probably was a stupid suggestion. I think that somebody had mentioned rubber bullets or rock salt or something like that would actually be a viable less than lethal option. Pumping somebody full of 1,000 pellets, even if they don't penetrate that deep, in some cases that's going to be worse. So I just wanted to give you some food for thought today. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.
Check out the Canadian Preppers Network blog, an excellent resource for survivalists and preppers.